El Sereno was not just any neighborhood in Los Angeles. To me, it was a place where every corner exuded the sadness of a life without escape. I was born in 1968 in a creaky wooden house that seemed always on the verge of collapse. My mother did everything she could to put food on the table, and my father, a calloused-handed mechanic, worked late hours, his face forever weary, his gaze empty. That gaze, however, conveyed more than words ever could. It warned me, without needing to speak, that life would not be easy. While the kids around me seemed used to living among cracked walls and streets marked by violence, I felt stifled by it. The sounds of sirens echoing through the nights were nearly constant, and my eyes would open, startled in the darkness, as fear gripped my heart. Life always seemed on the edge of collapse, as though something terrible might happen at any moment. But I had something that the others didn't seem to possess, a hidden hope, a spark within the notes and melodies that flowed through me. From an early age, I realized that music was my only salvation. The sound of my voice was my escape, my way of forgetting everything around me, and for a few minutes, transporting myself to a place where worries didn't exist. When I sang, there were no cracked walls, no hunger, no ever-present violence. I gave myself over completely, and each note seemed to take me farther from that neighborhood. Singing was like having wings, a way out of the suffocating reality. My mother, a woman of few smiles, always told me my voice was a gift. "You were born with it, Troy," she'd say, her eyes filled with an unshakable faith. She believed that somehow my voice would take me away from that place, and her hope was infectious. In the hardest moments, I would repeat to myself, "I'll get out of here, I'll make it." It was a promise, a silent oath I made to myself in the darkness of the room I shared with my siblings. The 80s were times of change and danger. For many, those were years of celebration, freedom, and unforgettable music. But in El Sereno, they were tough years, an era when drugs and violence became part of the neighborhood's daily routine. I saw childhood friends fall into that abyss, but I refused to be part of it. I kept my head down, focused on music, clinging to the one dream that gave me strength to keep going. To others, I was just another kid from the neighborhood. To me, I was on my way to something bigger. At 15, I got my first real chance. A local talent show was being held at the community center, and I decided to participate. I had nothing to lose, and maybe, just maybe, someone would recognize my talent. I sang like never before and felt my voice fill the small auditorium, packed with neighbors who, like me, were looking for a reason to carry on. I won first place, and with it, a small contract to record a song. That was the beginning. At that moment, I started to believe that maybe my destiny was about to change. With the contract in hand, I realized that, finally, life might take me beyond El Sereno's borders. The days that followed were intense, full of rehearsals and preparations for my first recording. Every minute in the studio was a dream come true, a chance to leave my mark on the world. My parents were proud, especially my mother, who saw it as proof that everything she had sacrificed for me was worth it. The song I recorded was simple, but my voice was there, steeped in the emotion of a life of struggle. Gradually, I began to be recognized in small circles around the city. People talked about the song and spoke of me with a mixture of curiosity and expectation. I was invited to perform in clubs and bars, places where, finally, the music I loved found a home. Those small stages were my arena. There I transformed, going from the kid from the neighborhood to something more. With every performance, I felt the audience's energy, and it fueled me in a way that's indescribable. But the path wasn't easy. The night was full of dangers and temptations, and the places I performed were often surrounded by people who had lost their way. Drugs, drinking, and fights were part of that world, but I tried to keep my distance. It was like walking on the edge of an abyss, where any misstep could cost me everything. Even so, I stayed focused, with the image of my mother and my tired father giving me the strength to go on. Music kept me sane, kept me away from mistakes that could destroy me. These performances also brought something I didn't expect, a sense of belonging. Although I still lived in the same neighborhood and faced the same problems, being on stage made me feel different. I wasn't just Troy, the mechanic's son, anymore. I was someone with a voice, someone who could be heard. This feeling was new, but it took root in me like a need, something I sought more and more with each show, each note. My music began to echo through the nights of Los Angeles, and I felt that an escape from that world was finally within my reach. My friends in the neighborhood saw in me a kind of hope, proof that someone like us could have a different future. To them, I was an example. To myself, I was just a kid trying to survive. Each night, I returned home with a tired body but a mind full of dreams. I felt that with a little more effort, my chance was just around the corner, waiting for me. One night, after a show, life handed me an opportunity that seemed like a dream. A mysterious man approached me and handed me an invitation. It was an elegant card, written on thick, fancy paper with gold details that stood out. When I read it, I realized it was an invitation to an exclusive party at the mansion of a famous Hollywood producer. It seemed like the chance I had always been waiting for, the door I needed to open to finally leave El Sereno and reach the world. The invitation, however, was more than just a piece of paper. It was a promise. That card became my talisman, the symbol that my life was about to change. This is the beginning of everything, I thought. I spent hours looking at that card, reading and rereading the producer's name in golden letters. The glamour of the invitation filled me with anticipation, but at the same time, a subtle unease crept in. Something about the situation felt off, as if I were about to step onto unknown, dangerous ground. With the invitation in hand, I ran to show it to Jimena. She was my childhood friend, almost a sister, always by my side every step of the way. But when she saw the card, her eyes narrowed and her face darkened. She'd heard the rumors circulating in our neighborhood, stories about Hollywood producers with questionable reputations. "Troy, be careful," she said, gripping my hand tightly. "That world isn't what it seems. I've heard terrible things about people like that." That night, Jimena's words echoed in my head, but my ambition spoke louder. Growing up in El Sereno meant living in the shadow of dreams that would never come true. That card was an escape, a possibility of a life my parents had never had. I knew she was worried about me, but my desire to leave that neighborhood was stronger than any warning. So, I tucked my doubts away in the back of my mind and decided that, whatever happened, I would be at that party. The days leading up to the event were filled with an almost painful anticipation. I spent hours imagining the mansion, the producer, and the people who would be there. Would they be like me, young people looking for a chance, an escape? Or would they be people already immersed in that world, entangled in the secrets Hollywood's own glamour hid? My heart raced every time I thought about it, but my desire to succeed was stronger. Nothing would make me give up. Jimena called me the night of the party. Her voice was laced with worry, and I could feel the tension in every word. "Don't go, Troy. I heard horrible stories about that place," she insisted. I tried to reassure her, saying I'd be careful, that nothing bad would happen. But deep down, a shadow of doubt started to form. I put on my best outfit, looked in the mirror, and took a deep breath. This is my chance. I need this. With a tight heart, I left home, leaving behind the comfort of everything I knew. When the taxi pulled up to the mansion's iron gates, I felt the weight of a choice with no return. I looked at the massive gate, with sculpted eyes that seemed to watch me, and the triangular symbol at the center that pulsed in response to my own anxiety. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease. When the door opened, I entered, feeling like I was crossing a threshold into a new world, a darker and perhaps more dangerous one than I could ever imagine. That night, as I waited for the taxi, the phone rang. It was Jimena, and I could tell she was upset. She had always had an intuition about things, and in that moment, she seemed to sense something dark that I, wrapped up in my own excitement, was trying to ignore. "Troy, don't go to that party," she whispered, as if the danger could hear her on the other end of the line. There was fear in her tone, a fear that made my hands tremble. I tried to act confident, laughing and telling her she worried too much. Jimena insisted, and I could hear how serious her warning was. "My dad used to work in places like that. He always said that world was strange, as if there was something hidden," she continued, almost pleading. I knew she was just looking out for me, but at that moment, my ambition blinded my judgment. I tried to calm her, saying I'd be careful, but she didn't seem convinced. "Promise you'll call me as soon as you can?" she asked, her voice trembling with worry. I promised, but deep down, I knew that promise was hollow. Before hanging up, Jimena said something that still echoes in my mind. "Troy, I feel like this party will change you forever, and not for the better." Her words were like a last-ditch plea, a desperate attempt to stop me from taking that step. But I was so determined to leave El Sereno, to make my dream a reality, that I didn't pay enough attention to what she was saying. The taxi arrived, and I got in, carrying with me a mix of excitement and apprehension. As the car glided through the streets of Los Angeles towards the mansion, Jimena's words still danced in my head. I tried to push away that feeling of unease, telling myself everything would be fine, that this would be the night that would change my life forever, for the better. But there was something in the back of my mind, a shadow, a doubt I couldn't shake. I started to imagine what it would be like if I listened to her and backed out, going back home, but at the same time, I knew I wouldn't have another opportunity like this. When we reached the mansion's gates, I looked at my phone one last time, considering calling Jimena back and telling her she was right. But just then, a security guard opened the taxi door and pointed me towards the path. The gate opened slowly, revealing the imposing mansion and its shadowy gardens, and in a blink, I went in. In that moment, I felt as though I was crossing a line from which there would be no return. Little did I know, Jimena's warning would echo in my nightmares for years to come. Jimena's image was left behind, and the comfort she represented vanished as soon as I crossed that gate. I was about to plunge into a world completely different from what I knew, and even though I didn't fully understand what that meant, I felt that nothing would ever be the same. Inside that mansion, far from the eyes of those who knew and loved me, I was beginning to feel that the fame and success I had longed for came with a price far higher than I could imagine. Getting out of the taxi and approaching the iron gates, I was overcome with a feeling of discomfort. It wasn't just the imposing size of the gate or the dark garden surrounding it. There was something in the details, in the sculpted eyes that seemed to follow me with every step, as though the mansion itself had a mind of its own, a hunger to consume me. The gate opened with a long, deep creak, like the sigh of an ancient creature awakening from an eternal slumber. Crossing the gates, my eyes were drawn to a series of strange symbols decorating the columns and the floor. A triangle with an outstretched hand at the center of a black sun dominated the entrance, and I remembered seeing something similar in a documentary on the occult. The symbol seemed to pulse and sync with my heartbeat, as if there were a connection between that place and my own body. Every step I took deepened my feeling that something very wrong was about to happen. The mansion's gardens were another spectacle of darkness and oddity. Instead of ordinary statues, there were figures that looked like they had come from a nightmare. Hybrids of humans and animals with winged bodies, goat heads, and expressions of pure horror. The more I walked, the more those statues seemed to come alive, with shadows stretching on the ground as though they were drawing closer to me. It was as if each figure held a dark secret, a piece of the place's hidden past. Finally, I reached the mansion's entrance, where a butler with a lifeless, almost inhuman expression gestured for me to enter, and as I passed through the door, it closed behind me with a dull thud, cutting off my connection to the outside world. The silence inside the mansion was crushing, as though the very air were poisoned with something ancient and malevolent. The lights were dim, just enough to reveal strange paintings on the walls, abstract figures that seemed to move and contort when stared at for too long. Each painting I looked at increased my unease. In one, a giant, I was surrounded by tiny human figures twisted in agony, as if trapped in an endless cycle of suffering. Another painting showed a dark portal, with hands reaching out in desperation, trying to escape from something unseen. The environment seemed designed to disturb, to make any visitor feel small, insignificant, and fragile. I was breathing heavily, the dense air making each breath difficult. Everything around me told me to run, but my ambition kept me anchored there, pushing forward through those unsettling symbols and horrible paintings. With every step, I felt I was leaving a piece of my sanity behind, trading it for the promise of success that, in that moment, seemed more and more like an illusion. Inside that mansion, the deepest secrets of fame were revealed, and I knew that once uncovered, there would be no going back. Entering the main hall, I was greeted by an explosion of lights and music that momentarily blinded me. The party was grand, with lights dancing in hypnotic tones that bathed the space in a surreal atmosphere. In the back of the room, a group played intense music, a mix of rock and tribal rhythms that seemed to pulse directly in my veins. My senses were confused. Every beat of the music reverberated in my chest like a war drum, speeding up my heartbeat and stirring a strange desire to lose myself in that chaos. The place was filled with young people, all apparently happy, dancing and chatting, as if this were the best night of their lives. However, there was something wrong in their expressions, in their distant gazes. They seemed to be in a trance, trapped in a reality of their own, where time didn't exist and worries were just a vague thought. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the more I looked around, the more I sensed something deep and terrible was happening here. The atmosphere of the party was a mix of paradise and hallucination. People laughed and danced, but their laughter echoed in a strange way, as if recorded and replayed with a twist. The lights blinked to the rhythm of the music, and a thin mist filled the air, making the environment even more ethereal. Amidst this frenzy, part of me knew I should leave, but my body felt stuck, as if some invisible force were holding me in place. I sat on one of the red sofas arranged along the room, trying to catch my breath and collect myself. It felt as if something were draining my energy, slowly weakening me, making every thought a struggle. A striking young woman approached me, sitting beside me with an expression that mixed curiosity and interest. "What's your talent?" she asked, and my answer came out shaky. "I sing rock." She smiled, but her eyes showed no joy, only a strange coldness that made me uncomfortable. The girl kept asking me questions, her hand resting lightly on my knee, a touch that should have been comforting but chilled me to the core. I forced myself to relax, trying to convince myself everything was normal, but something in her touch, in the way she moved, sent shivers down my spine. When I noticed a small triangle tattooed on her neck, identical to the symbol at the mansion's entrance, a silent alarm went off in my mind. Every fiber of my being screamed that I should leave, but I felt paralyzed, trapped by that seductive and menacing presence. Suddenly, she got up to get a drink, leaving me alone with my thoughts. While waiting, I watched the crowd in front of me, noticing how deeply everyone seemed immersed in that insane atmosphere. I tried to convince myself everything was fine, that it was just a party, but a shadow of doubt gnawed at my mind. When she returned with the drinks, something in me already knew that this night would take a much darker turn than I could have ever imagined. The music stopped abruptly, and an almost unbearable silence filled the room. It was as if the air itself had frozen, dense and heavy, making it hard to breathe. All the guests turned toward the stage, their gazes fixed and expectant, as if they were waiting for something grand and terrible. That was when he appeared, an imposing figure, dressed in a black suit that seemed to absorb all the light around him, entered slowly, each step reverberating on the floor. This was the producer, the man behind all the glamour and mystery. He stopped at the center of the stage and raised a wine glass, flashing a smile that sent chills through me. It was a strange smile, cold, that didn't reach his eyes, as though it had been practiced to look friendly but hid something far darker. "Welcome, dear guests," he said, his deep, enveloping voice filling every corner of the room. "This will be a night you will never forget," he continued, his words carrying a promise that sounded almost like a threat. Something inside me screamed to get out of there, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. As he spoke, his words hypnotized the crowd, who looked at him with almost religious reverence. "You're about to start a new chapter, a chapter of success and glory," he said, his eyes scanning each of us, as if assessing us. I felt exposed, as if he could see all my secrets and deepest fears. He promised fame and power, everything we'd ever dreamed of, but the tone of his voice made it clear there was a price to pay. A price that, in that moment, I still didn't understand. Then, the producer made a gesture, and several young figures climbed onto the stage. I recognized some of them. They were familiar faces, music icons I admired. There were Prince, Whitney Houston, Cyndi Lauper, and a young Madonna. But something about them seemed off. Their eyes were vacant, as if the life had been drained from their bodies. Their expressions were rigid, and their movements mechanical. This was a group of stars, but there was no shine in them, only a strange stillness. I realized then that they were puppets, controlled by someone, perhaps by the producer himself. The producer, with a triumphant smile, introduced each of them, saying they were his creations. "Everything they are, they owe to me," he declared, as though he were a god creating his creatures. "Look at them and see what success can bring," he said, with a crazed glint in his eyes. The audience clapped frenetically, but to me it was terrifying. It was as if I were witnessing something forbidden, something that ordinary people should never see. In that instant, I began to understand that the glamour of this industry concealed a dark side, a darkness that consumed those who dared to be enticed. Suddenly, the producer turned to us, the young artists at the party. "You, like them, can reach stardom. You just need to accept what I offer," he said, his tone almost seductive but with a hint of menace. A chill ran down my spine, a feeling that this offer was more dangerous than anything I had ever faced. I knew that moment was decisive. I could accept and follow that path, or I could flee. But as I looked into Madonna's empty face, I realized that maybe the choice had already been made for me. While the producer spoke, I couldn't tear my gaze away from the celebrities beside him. They were there, motionless, as though trapped in a deep trance. Each of their movements seemed calculated, almost robotic, and the smiles on their faces were forced, without any hint of genuine joy. It was as if all life had been drained from them, leaving only an empty shell that blindly obeyed. At that moment, a chill ran down my spine, a sense that I was witnessing something I shouldn't. The most disturbing part was how they avoided looking directly at the audience, as though they knew that, by locking eyes, they might reveal the emptiness inside. I saw in them a silent suffering, a futile attempt to break free from something invisible but immensely powerful. It was as if each of them carried an internal prison, a mental cage they couldn't escape. Young Madonna, in particular, seemed on the verge of a breakdown, her gaze as lost as someone who no longer knows who they are. At one point, the producer asked Madonna to say a few words to us, the new artists. She stepped up to the microphone, but her voice was weak, hesitant. It was as if she were struggling to remember what to say, and her words came out trembling, senseless. Each time she stumbled, her face twisted into an expression of fear and shame, as though she'd been conditioned to fear even the smallest mistake. The crowd applauded, but I saw the terror in her eyes. She was there, but she wasn't. The presence of the other celebrities was equally unsettling. Each of them seemed marked by a kind of exhaustion, with deep bags under their eyes and rigid expressions. Whitney Houston, always known for the strength and liveliness of her voice, was unrecognizable, just a pale shadow of who she once was. I realized these young people weren't just stars. They were prisoners of something beyond their control, something that kept them in that position against their will. As I watched them, I felt like I was seeing my future. There on the stage were the idols I had always admired, turned into puppets, living dolls, controlled by an invisible force. This was a glimpse of what I could become if I accepted the producer's offer. I would be famous, yes, but at the cost of my freedom and sanity. I began to question everything, what I truly wanted, and whether I was willing to pay such a high price for success. At that moment, the producer signaled, and the celebrities slowly moved off the stage, as if they were being led away to a place where no one else could see. Their figures disappeared into the shadows, but the horror I had witnessed stayed etched in my mind. The images of their empty faces would haunt me forever, and I knew this was a warning. The fame I sought had too high a price, one that could take my soul. When I thought the night couldn't get any stranger, I felt a pressure on my back, a hand guiding me along with the other young people out of the hall. There was no resisting it. We were led down a dark corridor that seemed endless, with a constant humming that vibrated beneath our feet. My legs felt heavy, as though I were walking into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. As we moved forward, the humming grew more intense, nearly unbearable, and I felt my mind begin to unravel. The door opened to a dark room, dimly lit so that I could barely see the walls around me. Each of us was placed in a chair, and before I could react, my arms were bound, leaving me completely immobilized. Around me, other young people were in the same situation, their faces frightened, some silently crying as though they already knew what was about to happen. Desperation overtook me, but there was no escape. The door closed and darkness enveloped us. Suddenly, a set of giant screens lit up before me, displaying rapid, disturbing images. Triangular symbols rotated in all directions, changing color and pulsing like a beating heart. The flashing lights made my head hurt, while distorted sounds reverberated in my ears, hammering at my mind. The images invaded my brain, crushing any thought I tried to have. It was as if each one were a knife, slicing through my consciousness, leaving only fragments. The panic grew with every second, but I couldn't scream, I couldn't move. My vision started to blur, and I no longer knew what was real or what was being projected into my mind. The screens showed scenes of violence, lifeless faces, and symbols intertwining like a web. I felt my body as an empty shell, being drained by an invisible force that overwhelmed me. An echo of voices began to whisper around me, instructions without meaning that pierced into my thoughts. In the trance, I heard the producer's voice, distant but clear enough to make me shudder. "You will be our new tools, our ambassadors. You will be famous, but you must learn to obey." His words were like poison, corroding my will and implanting forced obedience in my mind. I wanted to resist, to fight against it, but my body and mind wouldn't respond. Every part of me was taken over by that presence, by that inescapable command. Over time, the deep hypnosis began to drown me in increasingly intense hallucinations. I saw my own face distorted, lost, as if it no longer belonged to me. Images of my childhood blended with dark visions, and a silent scream echoed inside me. I knew that if I didn't fight, I would become just another prisoner, a puppet in the producer's hands. But at that moment, I was defenseless, immersed in a sea of control that threatened to erase everything I was. Time seemed to dissolve as I remained trapped in that chair, submerged in an endless nightmare. The screens in front of me continued displaying distorted images, scenes that mixed horrifying figures with symbols that pulsed hypnotically. My mind was bombarded by sounds and lights, a frenetic rhythm that seemed to sync with my heartbeat, speeding it to the limit of what I could bear. Every time I tried to fight, a sharp pain pierced my head, as though something or someone were controlling my thoughts and my very will. At some point, I started to have hallucinations. Images of my family, friends I'd left behind in El Sereno, and even my mother appeared on the screens, but distorted, macabre. I saw my mother, her face disfigured, screaming for help as her hands reached out to me. My own voice echoed, mixed with screams and incomprehensible sounds. Each image felt like a direct attack on my soul, as if they were trying to erase every memory and replace my mind with something new, obedient and empty. Tears began streaming down my face, but I couldn't move. I felt the cold wetness on my skin, but didn't have the strength to wipe them away. My muscles ached, and my body trembled, seized by spasms I couldn't control. The feeling of being watched grew with every second, as though thousands of invisible eyes were judging me, studying my reactions. I looked around and saw other young people bound in chairs like mine, their faces pale and empty, as if they had already been completely consumed by the process. Then, I saw one of the young people start to convulse violently. His eyes rolled back, and blood began to trickle from his nose, ears, and mouth as his body thrashed uncontrollably. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I felt panic swelling inside me, but I was paralyzed, forced to witness that horrifying scene. The producer and the men around watched indifferently, as though it were a simple, expected reaction. I was on the brink of collapse, knowing that could be my next experience. The air was filled with the metallic smell of blood, and the distorted sounds now seemed like whispers, voices echoing in my mind, ordering me to submit, to surrender to the control. An indescribable terror took hold of me, but a small part of my consciousness fought to resist, to avoid being swallowed by that darkness. The control they wielded was like a sticky web, infiltrating my mind and threatening to suffocate me. I knew that if I didn't escape, I would lose my sanity forever. With the last bit of strength I had, I tried to focus on something positive, something that would keep me grounded in reality. Jimena's image appeared in my mind, her voice soft yet firm, saying I had a gift, that I should protect what was mine. Clinging to that memory, I managed to hold on a little longer, but I knew my mind was fragmenting, and that maybe it was just a matter of time before I became a hollow shell like those around me. In the midst of the mental torment, the screens began to dim, and the producer finally appeared before us, watching us like a hunter assessing his prey. His eyes gleamed with sadistic satisfaction, pleased by the sight of us in such a state. "You are ready for a new beginning," he said, his voice cold, without compassion, like a scientist admiring a successful experiment. "Fame, power, it will all be yours, but with one condition: you must obey. Without question, without resistance." His words reverberated in my mind, and I realized he saw us as tools, as toys to be manipulated and used at his whim. "This process," he continued, "isn't just about control. It's to ensure that all of you, young prodigies, become the voices we will guide as we please." As he spoke, he looked at each of us, as though he knew exactly where to push to break our resistance. The idea that they could erase my identity and turn me into a puppet was terrifying. While he spoke, I saw the other young people around me nodding in agreement, as if they were already under his spell. Their expressions were blank, and their eyes lifeless, indicating that most of them had already given in. A desperate fear gripped me. I knew I needed to escape, but the sense of helplessness was overwhelming. My hands trembled, and the thought that they could take everything I was filled me with despair. It was like sinking into quicksand, unable to escape. The producer continued explaining the methods of control, the mental conditioning processes, and the devices used to ensure absolute obedience. "You will be the next stars, but you will never be out of our control," he said calmly, making me feel sick. My stomach turned as every word he spoke seemed to eat away at a piece of my soul. I was trapped, and the price of success was total submission. It was a silent pact, a slavery disguised in promises of glory. At a certain point, the producer snapped his fingers, and a side door opened, revealing a group of men and women with blank expressions. "These are those who tried to resist," he said with a slight smile. I looked at these people and recognized many as artists and celebrities I'd seen before, but now they were unrecognizable, with empty eyes and slow movements. They looked like zombies, vacant and devoid of will. "This will be your fate, should you choose not to cooperate," he concluded. The brutal reveal of their true intentions shattered my mind even further. I needed to escape, to find a way out before it was too late. But there, facing that threat, surrounded by familiar faces turned puppets, I knew it wouldn't be easy. The producer watched us with a look of satisfaction, and at that moment, I understood that to him, our lives were nothing more than pieces in his dark game of power and control. When the producer began speaking again, I felt a sudden urge to resist. It was as if the echo of Jimena's voice inside me had turned into a real force, an anchor keeping me from fully sinking into that nightmare. I remembered every conversation, every time she told me never to give up who I was, and in that moment, I clung to that idea as if my life depended on it, because it did. With what felt like an impossible effort, I started to try to loosen my bindings, moving my wrists until I felt the first knot begin to give. The screens flickered intensely, but now the hypnotic effect seemed to be fading. I looked around, trying to identify any weakness I could use to my advantage. With a final effort, I broke free of the bindings and stood up, breathing heavily, barely able to believe I was free. I looked at the others, but most were in a deep trance, and I knew I didn't have time to help them. Either I escaped at that moment, or I would end up like them. Fear mixed with adrenaline guided my steps. I staggered out of the room and ran down the dark corridor, where the humming and voices seemed to be trying to pull me back. Each step was a battle against dizziness, against the panic that was taking root in me. I heard shouts and footsteps behind me, but I didn't look back. I knew the producer and his guards would be after me, and my only chance was to find an exit as fast as possible. My legs were weak, but my will to survive was stronger. I was on the brink, but I couldn't stop. I passed through dark rooms and endless corridors where shadows danced on the walls, forming twisted figures that seemed to mock my escape. Each door I opened increased my desperation. None led outside, only to other dark and claustrophobic spaces. The mansion felt like a hellish labyrinth, created to imprison anyone who tried to escape. I was on the edge of total panic, but as I turned a corner, I saw the front door. One last hope. Taking a deep breath, I rushed toward the door, not looking back. As soon as I reached it, I pushed with all my might, feeling the resistance of the old hinges. The fresh night air hit me like a shock, filling my lungs with renewed strength. But the nightmare wasn't over yet. As I crossed the door, I felt a hand grab my arm, and when I turned, I faced the chef of the party, his gaze full of fury that froze me. He whispered something inaudible, but I saw the hatred in his eyes. With a last desperate effort, I pulled my arm and pushed him back hard, breaking free. The chef stumbled backward, and I ran, every cell in my body telling me to keep going, not to look back. My legs felt like lead, but I didn't stop until I reached the street. There, in the middle of the night, I saw a taxi and waved frantically. I jumped in and shouted for the driver to take me far away. As the car sped off, I looked out the window and saw the mansion recede, smaller and smaller, until it disappeared into the darkness of the road. The taxi sped down the empty road, and I felt my entire body shaking, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what I had just experienced. My heart was still racing as if I'd been running, and my mind was spinning, torn between the relief of escaping and the horror of all I had witnessed. When we reached a safe spot, my first thought was to call Jimena. My voice trembled, barely able to speak, but I managed to ask her to come get me. "I need help. I'm not safe," I whispered, and she understood immediately. Jimena arrived in minutes, her expression a mix of fear and concern. When I got into her car, she didn't ask any questions. She knew I wasn't ready to talk. During the drive to her house, silence hung between us, heavy with things I needed to say but couldn't put into words. With every street we passed, I looked back, expecting to see some sign of pursuit. But everything was quiet, at least for now. When we arrived at Jimena's house, she took me to a secluded room and made a hot drink. She sat beside me and, without pressing, waited until I was ready to speak. My voice came out hesitant, the words stumbling as I recounted every detail of that terrifying night. I told her about the party, the producer, the empty faces of the celebrities, the mental conditioning in the attic. She listened silently, her expression growing darker, as though some of what I shared confirmed things she had long suspected. When I finished, Jimena took a deep breath and said with a determination that surprised me, "We're leaving here. We have to go far, where they can't find you." She explained she had family in Mexico, in a small rural town where we could hide. The plan seemed insane, but at the same time, it was the only solution. I knew the producer and his group wouldn't let someone who had seen so much escape. Within a few hours, we gathered some essentials and, with help from Jimena's family, set off toward the border, trying to leave the nightmare behind. The journey was long and filled with anxiety. At every stop, I expected to see someone from the producer's group watching, as if even the air itself were full of invisible eyes. But at last, we crossed the border and continued on to a small village hidden in the mountains. There, the landscape was simple and peaceful, a world far removed from everything we had left behind. For the first time since that night, I felt a peace that seemed real. It was as though Hollywood's shadows couldn't reach us here, in these mountains. As the months passed, we adapted to our new life. Jimena's family welcomed us, and little by little, I managed to rebuild my life, working at simple tasks far removed from the music industry. Jimena was always there, and our friendship evolved into something deeper, a partnership forged in pain and escape. We decided not to speak about the industry, to let that past remain in silence. However, the fear that they would find us never completely disappeared. Years went by, and the tranquility of the village gradually replaced the memories of the terror I had lived through. Jimena and I got married, and life finally seemed to take a calmer path. We had children who grew up far from the influence of that industry and everything it represented. I never told my children the full truth of what I'd been through, but I always warned them to stay away from the glittering promises and empty glamour fame could offer. For me, it was a matter of survival. But as my children grew, I saw that they too had interests and dreams. One of them, my eldest daughter, began to show interest in music. She was talented, as I once was, and inevitably, she was drawn to the popular songs that dominated the media. Though I knew I couldn't stifle her talent, fear resurfaced every time I saw her listening to certain artists, names I knew were possibly tied to everything that once haunted me. When my daughter mentioned her interest in a particular star, a sense of déjà vu washed over me. It was as if I were looking at my younger self, full of dreams, about to fall into the same trap. Each time she spoke of her idol, a chill ran down my spine, a sense of foreboding, as if something evil were lurking. I wanted to protect her, but I knew that telling her directly about my experience might spark a dangerous curiosity, and silence became my only option. Time passed, but the industry continued to evolve, and I knew that the control over stars and their fans only grew more sophisticated. Technology allowed a level of mass manipulation I could never have imagined. When I watched interviews or saw performances by certain celebrities, I recognized the same vacant stare I had seen that night, the same desperate emptiness that marked the eyes of Madonna and the others. To me, it was clear that the industry was still in the hands of the same dark figures, the same monsters. Today, my life is simple, and I rarely think about fame. Yet, I still feel as if I'm being watched, as if Hollywood's shadows still follow me from afar, waiting for the right moment to find me. Sometimes at night, I dream of the mansion, the producer, and his cold eyes, waking up with the feeling that they've never given up on me. Though I escaped once, I know the price of my freedom was high, and in a way, a part of me is still strapped to that chair in that attic. My story is a warning, a message for all those who dream of fame's allure without knowing what lies beneath. The entertainment industry is a gilded cage where success feeds on the souls of those who dare come too close. For me, this lesson was learned in the most painful way, and I leave this account as a warning. Don't let yourself be seduced by fame, for once inside that world, getting out is nearly impossible. I escaped once, but I don't know for how much longer I'll stay free.